Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
Okay, so Randy, the first question I have for you is, why is hunting so important to Montanans? And if you could kind of paraphrase the question.
Yeah. Hunting in Montana is so hard to explain for those who maybe don't live there and experience it. It is who we are, it's what we identify with, it's expressed in our landscapes, it's expressed in what we celebrate, it's expressed in so many ways. And what I find interesting is a lot of people love Montana and they love so much about it. What you see when you come to Montana, you are seeing a conservation ethic expressed in ways that you may not even understand. But trust me, it is being expressed.
Yeah, no, that's great. We talked about at your office the elk and deer management issues. And so, how important are landowners in this equation on elk and deer management in Montana?
When you are in a state where 2/3 of the land mass is privately held, like Montana, you cannot have conservation on a large landscape scale without having amazing private land conservation stewards. And that is what we have in Montana. And they have been there for a long, long time. And they're there trying to make their living, but they are as committed to wild spaces, wild places, and wild things as a lot of us are. And I hope that we never overlook that contribution that these private land stewards make towards proper and robust management of wildlife in Montana.
The television show, Yellowstone. Of course, the working title of the film is The Real Yellowstone. We're talking to all these multi-generational ranchers and kind of the relationship with the land and the wildlife, and will the next generation stay on? Because, we firmly believe that once you get somebody doing a good job of conservation, you hate to see them, that you lose that next generation. And there's all kinds of things out there that may keep the next generation off the land. And we're investigating all that. But this television show has had a huge impact on Montana. What has Yellowstone meant to the people of Montana, the land, and the wildlife?
Yeah. When you look at the issues they discuss in that TV series, a lot of them there is a practical application and challenge that generational landowners face in Montana that get mentioned in that series. How they play out and the application of them are probably different than what Hollywood would paint, but I've had the benefit of being a C.P.A. in Montana for over 30 years, and a large part of my practice has been succession and estate planning, which involves a lot of these landowners. And the challenges they face are really hard to describe until you sit at their kitchen table or you sit at my office desk and you talk about these things and you see their passion and their desire to keep these lands the way they are, to keep these lands in working agriculture. And there's pressures. The pressures are so intense, and it's not getting easier to solve these problems they're facing. It's getting more difficult. And I want to make sure they have every tool possible for them to do what they want to do with these properties that they have worked so hard to keep. And I don't care if it's ways we can use the tax code, through conservation easements, through donations, through whatever it might be, to incentivize private landowners to do the right thing and do conservation. We can't have just one little tool, because they are as unique and diverse as any group you'll ever meet, but they all have this conservation ethos that I think, as a public, we are vested in with them, and we need to support them towards that end in any way possible.
And since you're a C.P.A. and you brought this up, the succession deal, it's one of the issues we get into, and really I'm come to the realization, Randy, that I think the biggest threat to conservation in Montana is that.
Yeah,
is the fact that ranching's not easy. It's a hard, it's an eight day a week job, right? And it's very unforgiving. It's tough. It's brutal. It's not a simple lifestyle, but it's a passion that these people have.
Right.
And of course, they're the ones that are, a lot of wildlife lives on private land. So, but I see the issue, a big issue, being the fact real estate. the cost of it. Talk to me a little bit about what you've seen in the time you've been. And of course, you're from Minnesota, I'm from Michigan, but you and I have been there for decades, right? Multiple decades. I've been there for almost 30 years. You've been over for 30. We've seen this change in the landscape. What trophy ranches and the fact that the money that people will pay for land, not for a working ranch, but for a playground. How does that play into that succession and the threats that we have to wildlife today in Montana?
Yeah. In Montana, I don't know if people realize it because they wouldn't have a benefit of a career like I've had where I see the financial numbers of what comes with trying to make a living as a rancher. None of these people are getting rich. And when you look at the trend of my 30-some years in Montana of wealthy people buying, you can call it whatever you want, amenity ranches, trophy ranches, they are coming, and that changes how this landscape works for everybody. And I'm not here to say that people shouldn't be able to, spend their money however they want and buy whatever trophy ranch they want. But this has a significant impact on the people trying to make a living on those lands. Because if you think about, if you're the working landowner and you've had an arrangement with your neighbors where you've accommodated hunting or whatever to move the elk around and that worked real well, you worked with game and fish, and now you have some person who really doesn't understand the history of what that generational relationship of these landowners has been. So in these places, you get somebody who maybe comes in and buys a ranch, and when they do that, they bring their land ethic with them, which might be different in Georgia or Texas or Florida or wherever it might be. And it takes a while, if they are interested in understanding how these ranch communities have worked together for 100 years, even if they are interested in that, it takes a while for them to understand it. And some just are like, no, I own this, don't tell me what to do. I come here a month in the summer or whatever it might be. And it causes a lot of neighbor problems. And I think a lot of us who've been here for a long time, we see these neighbor problems, but there's really not much we can do about it. We respect private property rights in this country. And somebody who buys a ranch, you can do whatever you want with it. I just wish more of them understood how their activities might impact their neighbors. And then you start seeing this critical mass of people buying these ranches, and they're coming here from out of state, and there's nothing wrong with that. But coming and doing this and not trying to understand the people who are your neighbors makes the generational succession of these ranches more difficult. It makes the operation of these ranches more difficult. And pretty soon, we just end up with the pressures being so intense that families who've been on these properties for however many generations look at it. And I see it when I help them with their accounting and taxes, the numbers just aren't penciling out. And finally, they look around and say, you know what, why am I fighting this? And so for those who are able to sustain and keep it going and go to the next generation, they become even more critical to what Montana represents. And that's why I'm so passionate about trying to make sure they have whatever tools, expertise, and opportunity to do that, because they're kind of this shrinking, the last of their kind, as billions of dollars are being spent buying ranches in Montana. It just makes it that much more important that we listen and we try to understand and we help those who are continuing to do what they've always done.
So let's talk access.
Sure.
You're known as a huge proponent over access, public lands, but we have this, wildlife lives on private land.
Right.
Because there is so much pressure on public land, and so there's a lot of conflict there.
Right.
On the access side of things, we've got things going on like corner crossing, things like that. And of course, when I talk to these ranchers, they're like, hey, wait a minute here. What is your thought on access and how important it is? Should these people have access to this public asset, i.e. the elk or the deer or the antelope, whatever's on their property? And how does that work in the scheme of things? Because these ranchers, like we said, it's a tough life.
Yeah.
That's just another pressure we're putting on. So what's your thoughts on access?
Yeah. I've spent most of my life as an advocating for public land, public access, things like that. But you can't say you are a public land advocate without respecting the rights of the private land people. If you start ignoring the rights of one or the other, you really have lost your validity or your credibility in trying to craft solutions. And I will never advocate for anything that tramples or infringes on the right of a landowner. And some people say, well, those are the public's elk. They're held in trust by the state and they're on that private land. Well, guess what? They are. And the reason they are there very often is because hunting pressure on public land, better habitat than on public land. Elk, if we use that as the example, they don't just randomly pick to go there. They go there for reasons. So we either need access to the elk or elk in places that we have access to. The one part of that equation, through incentives and through other things, we have block management program, we have good neighbor policies, all this stuff where maybe that helps us get access to when elk are on private land. But there's no way we can force that, and there's no way we should force that. The other question we as hunters need to think about is, why aren't there elk where we have access? And what can we do from a management standpoint, a habitat standpoint, a season structure standpoint, to give elk more incentive to be over where we currently have access? So until we start having more elk where we have access, I think we're not focusing on the root of the problem if we just say, well, I'm going to ignore that and I want to look at these elk where I don't have access. You know, it's complicated. We're not going to solve it in a day or a week, but it is definitely an issue that we need to be thinking about, but it's got to be with the sideboards of respect for the private property rights, because a lot of these people are providing habitat that these elk live on for 4, 5, 6 months of the year, even though they may leave there and go to the public lands. Without that critical private land habitat, we don't have as many elk, as many deer, as many pronghorn. So it's easy for some people to just say, well, this is how it should be. No, we just got to work harder, work smarter, and craft solutions that work for all of us for the longer term.
So one of the ranches we're featuring is the C.P.A. Livestock Company.
Yep.
Okay? Chase Hibbert started this whole thing 3 decades ago of the Devil's Kitchen agreement. Right. The concept was to have bull elk die of old age.
Right.
And it's working.
Yeah.
Almost too good.
Yeah.
But it's brought in this whole thing. So we're talking about access, and you and I have talked about this before, trying to get access to ground. I had that tag there in the Round Square Butte area. Yep. It was a total shit show. Yep. And the only way I could get access to the actual deal was to pay some guys in Great Falls $15,000 to go hunt a goat. I wasn't going to do that. 99% of Montanans aren't going to do that. Yep. But in the case of the C.P.A. Livestock Company, because they have in-holdings there, and not big ones, I'm talking 320 acres, 120 acres, not full sections of BLM and public land, and because they've done a phenomenal job, the whole basin has, all the ranchers and everybody there in Forest Service, the state, they've got guys that are and they've been in block management for 3 decades. Right. If you call up Cooper Hibbert on the last Saturday in September, if you're one of the first 16 hunters to get a hold of them, you get a chance to hunt the 3rd and 4th weeks of the season. Right. And so, and they do a little bit of outfit in the 2nd week of the season, which these are people who come for 30 years, they're basically family, all that. But one of the issues we're getting into is this fact that guys are flying in helicopters and they're landing on these things when you've got resident hunters who've gone through the system, they have permission, and you're flying 100 feet off the deck in a helicopter, going through sites, looking for elk, and then you land on a guy who's trying to call an elk in during the bow season. It creates an issue. Right. What are you're a big proponent of access, aerial access and whatnot in the past. Yeah. How do we square with that?
Yeah. Well, there's so many things that when you start rolling back the layers about access and private property and the public's wildlife, you could pick 100 different examples, but the one that there's a few that stick out in my mind that I look for successes. Where are the places we can look to and say, what principles are at play here that created successes? And I think of the Devil's Kitchen area. That's a group of landowners who got together with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and it's been working pretty darn good for a long time. I've went and hunted cow elk on that through the block management program. And I look at that, and even though a lot of it is private land, it's neighbors working with neighbors. And if there's one thing maybe in this might be getting outside the specifics of this, but as a general rule, when we stop meeting over, a coffee or a lunch, and people, we don't put a face in an identity with somebody, they're just another person, we don't come to workable solutions. If there's one thing Montana's always been great at, it's that we have people who are willing to sit down and listen with intent. The intent being, how do we solve problems? Once we start, and it's very easy in today's world that, okay, I don't even have to go bang on a door to ask for permission. I just sign up on a sheet. I may never see that landowner. Those are trends, and I understand why they are there, but I often ask, are we losing this neighbor, this relationship thing? Because when we get back to a lot of these issues we're trying to solve, it's about people and it's about relationships. And everyone thinks it's about elk and other things. I don't care if we're talking about public access or checkerboard access or private land access. The human component and the relationship part of it and the respect for each other and trying to learn and understand what their situation is and what they need out of this to have a long-lasting solution, that comes with sitting down and being face to face. And every time I think about, all right, how can we solve some of these in the complicated landscapes of Montana and the changing of so many new non-resident landowners coming in? It's still, I come back to the principle of we have to sit down, meet with each other with respect, and try to solve those things that way. That will get us to the lasting solution.
So along those lines, one of the ranchers I'm featuring is down in the French Creek area, Drummond area, and he's part of a stock growers association. And he showed me this sign. I actually saw it on the Helmville Canyon at one time that said, basically, if you're a member of backcountry, Anaconda, this litany of sportsmen's groups, don't ask for permission to hunt on my land when you work against me most of the year, our lifestyle.
Yeah.
Why do we see things like that?
Yeah, we see expressed sometimes the frustrations of competing interests, maybe not sitting down and talking to each other. One group has influence in the legislature and they say, well, we'll just ram it down their throat. And then 4, 5, 6 years later, the other side has the power to do whatever, and they're like, well, we'll push it through. And every time it creates conflict, and that snowball gets bigger and bigger, and then we see people say, if you belong to this group, don't even come and ask. Or some group needs help, on that side, and we'll be like, you know what, hell with them, they screwed us over 4 years ago. That stuff drives me to tears, because I am here wanting lasting solutions far beyond. I'll be in the dirt for my vision of where I want these solutions to be and how long I want them to last. I will be long gone by then. And I think one thing that will get all of us respect from the other side is when we have the power to enforce or to put our will towards something, we don't necessarily just do that without appreciation and respect for those who don't have the power at that time. And as we try to solve this with legislatures and other stuff, guess what? Legislatures turn over every so often. Governors, elected officials turn over. Those aren't solutions that are going to get us there. History in Montana shows us those aren't the long-lasting solutions. So when people try to go that route, I try to say, let's pump the brakes here. Let's not do this, because we get upset. Whatever side you're on, you get upset if the opposition side does it. That doesn't make it right if you go do it when have the leverage of power. And so if we're serious about long-term solutions to these complicated things, it comes down to rolling up your sleeves and saying, you know what, this is going to be hard work. I'm going to have to take myself to the uncomfortable place of not advocating just for myself, but advocating for the solution. And that's hard to do, but that's where success comes in.
Great question and answer. And one of the things I noticed there was this I didn't realize shed hunting has become some addictive thing. And I ended up interviewing the guy who does all the shed hunting on the Dana Ranch. This guy named Bob Summers. And he says, wives, mothers will break the law to go get a shed. Really? And I was like, and of course these ranchers are like, especially the seamen, folks, they're just beside themselves. He says, we got people coming out here with thermal vision at night, night vision and stuff, and trespass and all that stuff. If you could sum up, what is this craze over sheds, and what is it doing out there to us?
A lot of people ask me for my opinions about the hunting or picking of shed antlers, and I'm probably not the guy to ask because I don't do it. When I find antlers, I hang them in a tree. So if you see one in a tree, you might say, oh, Randy Newberg's been here. But I can't deny the fact that the interest in it has risen so much in the last 20 years. And as someone who doesn't do it, I feel like I can look at it maybe a little more objectively. And I often question, are we doing what's right by wildlife by doing this? Because let's use elk for an example, they drop those antlers in late March and early April. This is their most critical time of the year. We should, if we say we're about conservation, we should be protecting them until they're starting to move and follow that green line in their migration back to wherever their summer range is. But we know that there will be people who go and do that. And they will be bumping these elk or these deer during those critical periods. And I don't understand it. I understand that for some people, they're making money at it. I understand some people just love wild things, and this represents something to them. But I think no matter which side of it you're on, even private landowners are saying, I can't believe the amount, I get more trespassing in shed antler season than I do during hunting season. So you add all these things together, and I think it's worth us asking ourselves, if we can step back and look at how this has changed, is this what's best for wildlife? Is this what's best for this resource we care about, that we build programs around, that we put money into? Are we turning a blind eye to something that maybe we have to start addressing? And it's hard for me as someone who doesn't do it. As quick as I say, we got to think about this, people are like, oh, you don't do it, so you don't think anyone else should. No, it's not that at all. I'm concerned about what the cumulative year-round impact is to our wildlife. It used to be there was hunting season. Now there's hunting season and shed antler season. And now with Montana being a national playground, the wildlife doesn't get a break from people throughout the summer either. And we look at why are animals no longer in places they used to be on public land, or why are the populations decreasing? We have all the studies that tell us why. It is the cumulative amount of human activity and human pressure that is impacting wildlife bit by bit by bit, but in its totality are significant impacts. And there's no doubt that people out looking for shed antlers, that's part of that equation that we cannot deny.
Yeah, and it's, at the end of the day, if we're going to call ourselves wildlife and habitat conservation, if that's the priority of what we're doing, because, we live in a society where we can outsource our killing, right? We don't have to kill anything to survive, but we have this North American model based on the incentives that we get because we utilize the resource. And I love the answer, though, about the fact that, hey, what's in best for the wildlife? And that's why I end a lot of my presentations. Okay, if you really think you're a conservationist, at the end of the day, did you make your decisions based on your, the dollar, the rand, your ego, your organization, your company? Right. Or was it for wildlife? And if it wasn't for wildlife and wildlife habitat, then I think I got a hard time calling you a wildlife and habitat conservationist. Yeah. And as you know, I don't have any problem telling you that. We talked in Bozeman about incentivizing landowners to open their lands up. Right. And so this 454 program, we actually went to the NBAR with Justin Taylor, their hunt manager for the Wilkes brothers. Mm-hmm. And I know there was a lot of angst over landowners getting guaranteed bull tags, elk tags. But as I understand it, as it's been told to me, they have to give an equal number of residents access to bulls, mm-hmm. and they have to have, I think it's 3 cow elk hunts for every bull tag. In the case this year, the Wilkes brothers got 4 tags, the two brothers and their wives. Okay. And they had to bring, I think, the 16 cow elk hunters out. Okay. Same thing last year. Last year, Justin tells me they ran over 400 cow elk hunts. Yeah. They take the guys out, they pay for their own gas, they get them out there, they show them where the elk are. They're licensed outfitters, they take you out. So we took a young gal out, first elk hunt, 20-year-old gal, and got up there and got onto a herd of hundreds of elk, and at 80 yards she shot her first elk. Just a great opportunity to get a young kid out hunting. Yeah. But there's a lot of angst towards some of these things.
Right.
How can we incentivize these landowners? Because we talked about all this pressure on public land, and of course the elk go there, and now we get these trophy ranches, and you got people out there that maybe they do hunt, but they don't want anybody else to move the elk off their property. Of course, we know what happens once the season's over; they're back on somebody else's place eating their hay and everything else. So, how do we incentivize these landowners to make these resources available, and for all of us kind of to maybe work together to manage these lands better?
Yeah. When I talk to my clients who are landowners and have elk problems, it's way more complicated than it seems. And as a hunter, I could just boil it down like, well, let the public have access to your place. And then you start talking to some of these people who have allowed the public on there. And some of the stories you hear, I would have never dreamed of. I did not. It never occurred to me that when they brought in 10 cow elk hunters, 8 of them weren't even capable of being able to harvest a cow elk. And so the amount of time it took them and just, okay, there's a wounded elk, or there's elk getting pushed all over and the fences are in worse shape than if they hadn't brought. The list can go on. And so I try to talk to hunters about that, to think about not everybody is like you. Not everyone's gonna go there and be respectful. A lot of people are just, not everybody's the same. We as hunters are not this monolith of people. And so the landowners end up having to encounter and deal with all of that large array of different talent levels, if you want to call it that, and different situations. And so a lot of people are like, well, then how do we get access? I think the big question is, how do we get elk in places we have access? That's one issue. And then the one that we tend to focus on a lot is, how do we get hunters access to the places the elk prefer? And that doesn't happen easily. Every state has come up with a different idea on it. Forever, it seems like Montana has always had a program where landowners get 15% of the limited entry tags. No strings attached. You get your own separate draw. Don't have to provide access, nothing like that. And some people in the legislature started experimenting with a program called the 454 program. And there's a lot of controversy about that. I think where any program, whether it relates to access or relates to allocation of opportunity, you need to have trust and you need to have transparency. And you need to have both sides feel that there's something in it for them. And so we have that program in Montana. It didn't get used for years and years and years, and they made some tweaks in it in the legislature. And now it's getting used a lot more. And now some people are pushing back saying, hey, we need more transparency in this. We need a different way to do it. I'm not saying what the answer is. I really don't know the answer, because every landowner is unique. And it's hard to design a one-size-fits-all program that addresses their needs, addresses how elk behave on their landscape, how that affects their neighbors. Like I keep saying, these are really complicated problems. But I do think if you are a landowner, incentives get your attention. And a lot of people instantly think that means transferable or saleable bull elk tags, or payments of, many tens of thousands of dollars. I think there's a lot of other ways that we can look at that can help these working landowners. We also got to be aware that there are some people who they bought a ranch in Montana and they're not interested in access. They don't even lease the place to an outfitter. It's just me and my friends come here and we hunt. So the spectrum of landowners and what their incentives are that they respond to is as diverse as any community. We just need to work harder at it. We need to think about what's the desired outcome, who are the people, the stakeholders who this is critical to, reflect as much of that as we can, and tweak programs in whatever way. And know that there are some that are just gonna be off the boards. I'd say in Montana, transferable bull elk tags are just, this isn't like New Mexico where it's gonna work. But that doesn't mean it's all one or the other. If we do fall into a trap in today's world that we think every decision is binary, that there's no other solutions in between there, to me that's lazy. And we in Montana have never been lazy about trying to solve our problems. And so I push away from these binary, got to be this way or that way, or one size fits all. And when it comes to giving incentives to landowners, I'm open to whatever works for all parties. And I think that's better for hunting, it's better for landowners, and it's better for the wildlife if we come up with what those solutions are. Because as quick as we start discouraging landowners in a state with 2/3 private land, if we discourage them from being the habitat stewards and the conservation open space stewards they are, we all lose. Wildlife loses. And I don't want to go to that point.
That's great. So you kind of touched on this thing. The next question is about commercialization of wildlife. I mean, we've got block management, we got trespass fees, we got outfitting. The N-Bar Ranch, $25,000 to come hunt a bull elk on that place.
Yeah.
I can't afford that.
No.
And I don't even try to take my kids hunting for elk because it's so difficult. And I've been here long enough to know a lot of people. Yeah, I could ask around and get permission, but what is this deal with commercialization? Should it be allowed? We've got a rancher that's dealing with 500 elk eating his haystack. He's feeding them most of the year, or they're coming down on the Sebin livestock company, and when things dry up high at the end of July or early August, and they're hitting the second cutting. That's the most important hay, right? They say it's about $150,000 every year worth of hay that they send. So they went into this whole program to try to stop it, but hazing and whatnot, and shoulder seasons. But this commercialization, I mean, what is it? Why is it? And is it something is it part of the toolbox?
Yeah. As a C.P.A, I maybe look at the term commercialization differently than other people. A lot of people think of it as just more revenue, more revenue, more revenue. I think about it as also recovery of cost and expense. If we're not recognizing the cost and expense that, say, a landowner is incurring, in fact, we're benefiting from a subsidy to our wildlife. And a lot of them do that, and they don't ask for any type of reimbursement or otherwise. And so this term commercialization gets thrown out there, and outfitting is commercialization, trespass fees, hunting clubs, you name it, their list and definitions of commercialization are out there. And I'm not denying that those transactional things exist. But when you have an asset as valuable as wildlife that lives a big part of its year on private assets, i.e. private land, and we are a society that is built around respect for private property rights, we have an economic system called capitalism where it's only reasonable that they're going to want to exercise their property rights in a way that benefits them. We're going to have some of this stuff. And people will say, well, it's the public's wildlife. Yes, it is. The courts have established that. But it's also private land. And so in this country, I view it as a blessing that we have this complicated, somewhat messy, sticky thing where we have a transient asset called wildlife held in trust for the public that at times is over here on private. So where is it that is quote unquote commercialization? Because a lot of people will make the cause that commercialization results in more conservation. And that can be a hard case to debunk, because a lot of the ranches that commercialize the elk create an awful lot of elk that move over to the public, and during hunting seasons, the public gets a lot of benefit of that. So a lot of people, I think, want to throw those terms around, and they become almost abstractions that we focus on without bringing ourselves back to the realities of, okay, why is this person needing to make money at it or recover costs at it? That's a big part of it. It's not so much making the money, it's just recovering the cost. And I try to put myself in the shoes of my landowner clients who, it's October, they're rounding everything up, they're sorting, and they're getting ready to ship all their cattle. And they're incurring a lot of costs because since about middle of July, there's been elk out there coming down off the public every night out in the second cutting, and that costs them a lot of money in terms of lost alfalfa, in terms of fences. And you can't have 300 elk on your property and think there's not an impact. So a lot of them, they recover that cost through the block management program or leasing to an outfitter or charging a trespass fee or whatever. And they get yelled at, oh, you're commercializing the public's wildlife. Are they, or are they just recovering some of the costs associated with the public's wildlife? And again, every time we get in these situations where we just throw grenades at the other side is because we haven't sat down and tried to listen and try to think about what is this person's daily life in relationship to elk or whatever the wildlife is on their property, and them trying to keep this ranch operating so they don't have to sell it to the next billionaire. So I think in Montana, as all these pressures come and come and come and build and build and build, 98% of the time, my view as a hunter is in parallel with the same goals as that landowner. So why do we let the 2 or 10% drive the wedge between us when we really are rowing 2 different boats, but we're trying to get to the same place? Productive private lands help the public's wildlife. And I accept the fact that there's times I'm not going to be able to go over there in November and hunt those deer that are in private. That's just part of this situation we have in the United States. And once we accept those as realities, we can start finding those solutions, learning from the solutions of the past that have worked, and finding the solutions that are going to carry us forward as the pressures get greater and greater and greater. And anyone who thinks these solutions are expensive today or hard to solve today, they're going to be more expensive and more complicated 10 years and 20 years from now. So let's quit pretending that we can solve it with an easy solution. Oh, well, just do this. No, this is going to take hard work. It's going to take commitment from everybody, but we're all going to benefit when we do that.
So the next question I have for you is, I told you one of the ranchers that we're featuring in the film, Eric Albus, who's also an outfitter.
Yep.
Threw his name in the hat to run for the legislature.
Yep.
And he won.
Yep.
So we went down last Monday, or a week ago Monday, to Helena and filmed him getting sworn in.
Yeah.
And met with a whole bunch of other legislators and all that stuff. And of course, we can talk a little bit about, so just tell me your thoughts of having a rancher outfitter run there, because his concern was what's the future for ranchers, for these generational ranching families.
Right.
I'm going to throw away that. Well. It's a thankless job, right? To get paid $79 a day or some shit like that. Yeah. I think it's $13 an hour, and they work 6 days a week. What are your thoughts on guys like Eric Albus running for office and being in the legislature?
Yeah. In Montana, we have a citizen legislature in probably the truest sense compared to a lot of other states, right? We meet every 2 years for 90 days. And some people would say, I wish we met every 90 years for 2 days. But we have working citizens who are there serving in our legislature. And they bring their diversity of interests. And I often hear, well, that person shouldn't be on this committee. All they care about are, this interest group or that interest group. And, when it comes to the ag community, agriculture is a huge part of Montana. And as a tax accountant, I look at our tax code. I'm like, that's an expression of what we prioritize in Montana. We have lower property tax rates for agriculture beyond anything. It's way, way lower. But you ask pretty much any Montanan, do you want to help these people keep these properties from being subdivisions and condos and ski resorts? And pretty much every Montanan says, I'm fine with that. So you look at a lot of these policies we have at a state level. Some will say, oh, that's because, the ranchers or the farmers had all this way, or that's because all those urbanites and Bozeman and Billings and Missoula and Helena and Great Falls and Kalispell, they've had all this way. Every side will pick the things that maybe they're frustrated with and blame it on the other side. But I do think if we have Montanans who come to our legislature with the intention of making Montana better, of making Montana what it has been and what it can be, versus, oh, my side won and I'm here to kick your teeth in, that will never result in a Montana that we want. So when I see that, in parts of Montana, we're going to have a heavy influence from the agricultural community, we should, because that's what their economy is. That's what their culture is. That's what they lived out there. And then some will say, oh, all you Bozeman people where I live, you guys are a bunch of crazies, blah, blah, blah. Well, our people who are elected from the Bozeman or, pick whatever city in Montana, that's going to reflect the people who live there and their interests. So I get people all, they tell, you hear them at the coffee shop or whatever, oh, these people, all those folks. So, no, it's Montana. It's a representative form of government. And if there's one thing that maybe is a trend nationally in the last 20 years, we feel that once we vote, we're done engaging in government. No, we're not. A vote is one day every 2 years or every 4 years. If you want governance that reflects what you believe, you have to go there and participate in it. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and say, okay, we're here to solve problems. This isn't, I'm here to get my way. So when I see people who are coming strictly from an agricultural standpoint, I accept that. I understand that. It would be foolish not to. Montana would not be Montana if everything was done by those of us who live in more urbanized areas. We have to have that if we want the Montana we're going to have. And so, I want to work with those people, and most of them I talk to, they want to work with other people because they understand the complications they face, the pressures they face, and they want solutions that aren't just going to work for them. They want solutions that are going to work for their kids and their grandkids and down the road because they value their way of life, right? I don't care who you are. Whatever culture and way of life you come from, you value that, and you're going to do what you can to try and keep that as best you can. That's just human, and if people weren't doing that, I'd question why the hell are you even here? So I respect it, I appreciate it, and I have no problem with if there's times I disagree with that policy of professionally, politely, engaging and saying, here's my perspective, have you thought about this? And for the most part, the overwhelming majority of them are still Montanans and they listen. And they're not here to just beat everybody over the head with their way of thinking. And that's what we're going to have, and that's what we should have.
Great answer. As I said, the answer before that, you actually answered my last question, is common ground. How do we solve all these issues? Because really that's where I see this in all these films. This thing in Scotland, all these rewilders stuff, they don't want to use science because it doesn't fit their spin, right? And okay, well, you're destroying thousands of years of soil history. You're destroying the habitat, according to the UN, is that, Rio Treaty and biodiversity is important.
Right.
But don't you want it to be nice? Yeah, okay, well then what's wrong with the people that manage the land for the wildlife?
Yeah.
And cultivate it so it's healthier,
right.
It has more biodiversity.
Yeah.
Based on science.
Yeah.
Again, this thing in Montana, I see so many. I talked to John Sullivan. John's like, we're gonna do this. Come down. I said, John, okay, right. Back off.
Yeah.
Calm down. One last question.
Sure.
American Prairie.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about it all, but
my opinions about it are out there everywhere. So it doesn't matter.
So just a little background, real quick. John Banovich, the artist, is on the board. Talked to him. He's a friend of mine. I ended up delving into this thing, went and saw the Save the Cowboy people, Laura Boyce and her husband out there in Winifred, talked to other people. I've heard all kinds of stories, and and it started 22 years ago, from what I understand. A bunch of black suburbans came barreling into people's driveways, these ranchers' driveways, all wearing suits, saying, we're going to save the prairies. Okay, a lot of people, a whole bunch of money. It's about 10 or 12 big donors, and that's the majority of it. Mm-hmm. But that land out there it's prairie, right? It's breaks country and all that. It's the reason why it's mostly BLM is because it wasn't workable for the homesteaders, right?
Yeah, and the homesteaders defaulted and gave it back.
Gave it back to the government. Right. So the only thing you could eke out of living was the bottom ground, where there was a little bit of water. And so, and really, in looking at American prairies, they say, hey, 90% of what we're trying to buy is great. It's the 10% that was under the plow, maybe, or whatever else in the valleys, in the watersheds there. That that's where probably we want to turn it back into prairie. Okay, great. We want to have bison all over that scale. Well, what I've started to see, Randy, is an organization that's evolving. Mm-hmm. We got 52 employees, 45 of them live in Montana. Some of them are multi-generational ranching families and all that come from that background. And interesting enough, their new chairman of the board, a guy named Bill Hilf. You probably don't know who he is, but this guy spent the last 7 years as the CEO of the Paul Allen companies, i.e. Microsoft, Paul Allen.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars.
Right.
He's here today at the sheep shop. He's an international big game hunter.
Oh.
I got on the phone with this guy, and we had a hour and 45-minute Zoom call.
Yeah.
I never had a Zoom call that long before.
Yeah.
I mean, me, like you and I are hunters, right? And we're all about trying to do what's right and want to make sure we leave a place better. He's in the same mold as you and I.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking all along that this APR is just a bunch of these city slickers from back east or Europe or whatever, the Save the Serengeti Foundation or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, what happens if we could have 4 times the amount of elk on our land?
Right.
What happens if you didn't have to wait 25 years to draw a bighorn sheepdog?
Right.
Wow, okay, you got my attention. And I went to a roundup, a bison roundup, and of course all they're doing there, they only have about 900 bison total.
Right. Yeah,
they got about 9,000 cattle out
Exactly.
there, but they're checking them for disease. Okay, that's great. All right, now we go down to Flying D. How many? I interviewed Mark Kessler, who ran all of Turner stuff.
One of my
on
C.P.A.
bison.
clients.
Yeah. 4,500 bison down there. Nobody's bitching about that, right? The governor's not suing Turner, right? And I'm sitting there going, well, wait a minute. How does all this count? Because we also know that elk carry brucellosis way more than bison do.
Yeah.
And of course, the bison are tested for it all the time, right?
Yep.
And so I'm just sitting there going, wait. And then Bill's talking about this stuff. I'm hoping to interview him today, he lives in Great Falls now. That's where his wife's from. Okay. But when I drove around there, who the hell uses APR land?
Yeah.
Hunters.
Right.
Because you can't use it in the summertime because you can, but if it gets wet, you're screwed, right? You can't get out anywhere. The roads are impassable. Well, there's nobody out there in the wintertime, right?
Right.
The fall, hunters. They're out there hunting birds. They're hunting, whatever they can get their hands on, elk and everything else. What is your thoughts of American Prairie from your perspective of what you've seen, and if in fact they're going to turn this potentially into a hunter's Valhalla? 4 million acres that's managed for wildlife and giving access through our block management. Bill says they're the largest block management participant at 85,000 acres in Montana.
Yep.
What do you think?
If there's a topic that kind of illustrates all that's going on in Montana for the last 10 years and probably will for the next 50 years, it's the discussion of a group called American Prairie and their efforts to figure out conservation solutions on what are currently private lands. They have ideas and thoughts about it, and then you have other groups that worry about what their goals are, what their motivations are, who's involved. You end up with all kinds of these things. And so I've always been all right, I just want to go talk to people. I've heard a lot of these opinions from my friends in the ag industry. So I went and talked to American Prairie. I'm like, all right, I want to know the details. And probably the first thing that struck me is when they said, right now we're leasing the lands we've acquired, we're leasing out pasture for 8,000 cattle. I'm like, wait a second, everyone tells me you guys are all bison. And I'm like, no, we have about maybe 1,000 bison after the calving season, but that was news to me. So as quick as I start asking questions and sitting down and meeting with people, wanting to know and see the face of who they are, it's like, wait a second. Both sides could easily have these preconceived notions because no one's in the same room talking and trying to look at this from the bigger standpoint of, if there's one thing a rancher or a farmer realizes instantly, it's this asset of this land and its productivity is paramount to my success. American Prairie is looking at it and saying the productivity of this land is paramount to our goals. And so maybe I'm naive, but I'm like, we have two groups that seem to have some disagreements, and fringes way over on the other side of them are trying to fester more conflict. But we have two groups that, in my mind, are looking at healthy, productive landscapes conserved for however long. And so I was like, are we creating a problem that maybe doesn't exist, or are we at least complicating a problem far beyond what we need to just because we're not sitting down and talking to each other? For me, I'm very happy for those landowners who sell to American Prairie, because they're probably not going to find a buyer in the traditional ag industry where it would pencil out to pay a price that American Prairie can pay this person. If one of my C.P.A. clients came and said, Randy, you know what, it's crazy for the kids to want to come back and run this ranch. It doesn't make any money. They got great jobs wherever. It's time to sell. and American Prairie is going to pay us this, or we could sell to one of our neighbors or someone else, and we're going to have to sell it on a contract and no down payment. And, I think that's enough for us to retire. But we could get twice as much or 150% that price over here. I'm going to tell them to take that over here. You've worked your whole life for that. You should be maximizing your property right. And then I see the legislature get involved in this stuff and try to make it, pass laws that certain groups can't own land. Or, well, when you say this group can't own land, you're taking away some of the customers or some of the potential buyers for this person who holds the property right today. And you're damaging and hurting them. So anytime the government says, I have a feeling about this and I'm going to pass legislation to impose my beliefs on you, those aren't solutions that are going to last for long. So when I look at American Prairie, because it's bison are a controversial species of the brucellosis that we have had contracted. The vectors always go back to elk, not to bison. And so bison have become a little bit of that, I don't know what you'd call it. I don't want to say boogeyman, but they are the fall guy for a lot of these things, even if the science and the history doesn't show them to be the problem that they're supposed to be. And then you have a group like American Prairie who has some goals related to bison. All of a sudden it's like a little bit of a campfire grows to a forest fire. And I think the way that those flames get tamped down is we try to see what is everybody's goal and how does that work. And myself as a hunter, American Prairie has, I think, over 80,000 acres enrolled in the block management program. You can cross their deeded land to get to public land without having to get permission. That's a level of access far beyond what I would expect out of a working farmer or a working rancher. And for different reasons, they got different goals. But as a hunter, American Prairie has been very good for access. And the people can say, well, that won't, how do you know that's going to last forever? I don't know that it's going to last forever. But if we engage with them and we talk and we express to them how important hunting is to the culture of Montana, and they want to be a good neighbor as they have worked hard, I think trying to learn along the way. I mean, they're a new group. Every group is going to make some mistakes. But if we can hold them to their commitment that they want to be good neighbors, part of being a good neighbor when you're a nonprofit group like they are would be to understand Montana's culture and what hunting's role is in that culture. And I think that's a big part of why they allow as much access as they do. So I have a hard time getting into this, oh, this side's all right, they're all wrong, let's fight and argue. It's like among all of us, we only have so much energy, so much resource to invest in this. Let's work towards solutions. And hopefully that will result in what's best for landowners, best for wildlife, best for hunters, best for Montana.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.